Hi there, I'm Ahsan, and you're watching me on YouTube and Facebook Live. Today we are going to talk about culture and consensus and how it is different in various parts of the world. When we talk about culture, then we are aware of the fact that different cultures are different in various parts of the world, and yeah, and the cultures have been evolving in various civilizations for the past thousands of years or more, and and they comprise of different beliefs, values, and so much information that it is difficult for a person to comprehend and remember all of the cultural information. And we have found a shortcut. The shortcut is we only remember some parts of it, and we follow those things. And thanks to the technology, it has allowed us, and media, it has allowed us to learn about different other cultures, and we only remember and know a few things, main categories of other cultures. And And for instance, I was born and raised in the Asian culture. Asian culture is very big in the subcategory of Indian, Pakistani, Punjabi culture, and I'm familiar with with the with some of the details of my culture, Punjabi culture, and I also spent a lot of time with the British and American people. Hey, Stephanie, and I learned some of the main things about Western culture and and now the fact is, many details are there, and I don't know about the whole Asian culture. I only know the Punjabi culture, and about the Western culture, I only know some of the main things about the Western culture. That's how. If we get things right, then things are good. The problem rises when we don't get things right, when we misinterpret things. We follow things where we have to avoid it. Culture and consensus is our topic for discussion today. And and my guest is Edward Konowicz, and he has joined us from Virginia, United States. Hey Ed,
Hi, everybody.
how you doing?
I'm doing okay.
So how was your live yesterday with the
It
missing
was
link?
it
Yeah.
was kind of amazing because we went 4.5 hours, and some
Four and a
people
half
stayed with
hours.
it. Yeah, over
Oh,
4.5 hours.
oh my. Yeah. Hey, Stephanie. Yeah, me too. I love culture as well.
Well, you can love culture, but the word has several meanings.
Hmm.
One is high culture, like music and painting and dance and clothing. And then the other is the actual customs of culture, which can be kind of cruel,
Yes.
burning witches, chopping off people's heads who insult a holy book. So I think we have to be careful. There's a lot of different meanings and definitions to the word culture.
Hmm.
All of
Hmm.
us like high culture. We all like some of the better music and the dancing and the art and the literature of different cultures. But then we also have the downside. We
Hmm.
have the cruelty of different cultures.
Yes. And when we go in the details of those cultures, then there's so much information there. We don't know about even if you ask me about Punjabi culture, and I don't know the details of it. I only know some parts of it. But when we go in the details about the subcategories and more subcategories of it, uh, then I don't know about those things. And same goes with the Western culture, and you are only familiar with the main categories of the Western of the American culture. When you go in the Europe, there's a different culture there.
I'm more interested in right now how consensus moves towards culture. And,
Hmm.
and we have two things. We have the natural culture, which is the art and music arising among the people. And then we have the imposed culture on top. And the imposed culture on top comes from consensus. I like pointing out how people are wrong because that means if I can show you you're incorrect in your thinking, I have taught you something. I have improved your life. And one of the things we keep hearing, and it's not true, they need your consent. They need your consent. You have to consent to the contract or to government. It's not true. And you can see this. People are being fired from their jobs without their consent. They get arrested without their consent. They um, they get robbed without their consent. They're taxed without their consent. So people have a misconception of the word consensus, like they have to give their consent. It's not true. Which at the top of
Speaking of
culture,
consent, it reminds me that I read a post from Jesse. YouTube removed his channel.
really, yeah.
Yes, including all the content, all the videos and everything. They
But
just removed it
I
permanently.
think he's been used to things like that. I think he's saved his content other places.
Yes, it is saved on Facebook, but from YouTube it is removed permanently.
Yeah, well, you can't have too many people speak what they think is the truth. We are under a totalitarian regime that
Mm,
uses censorship to stop debate.
yes,
I don't want to
you just
say
have.
they're censored because of truth. They're censored because they want to debate about what is true, and we're not supposed to. We're supposed to accept the consensus, which is on the television and in the newspaper. We're supposed to accept the consensus or be punished. No
Yes.
consent about it.
Mhm.
Well, of course, many cultures are being lost. Obviously, native
Uh-huh.
cultures
Yes.
and their languages have been destroyed. And most cultures are going to be destroyed because a lot of culture, what we consider, high culture, music, dance, literature, it comes from the people, not from consent.
Hey,
It doesn't
Amanda.
come from the top, which is consensus. So
Yes.
we have two cultures, the one coming from the top by the dictators, and the one
Hmm.
coming from the bottom where people are artistic and creative. And we shouldn't confuse the two cultures. They're two different concepts, two different realities.
Yes, and they have been evolving, and they are evolving right now.
Or
The create.
devolving.
Yes.
You
Yes,
could say
it could be.
devolving.
Yes, it goes both ways.
Yeah, things create and collapse.
Yeah.
And I think we're in a collapse stage where individual culture is being destroyed.
I
And
think
that's,
when people are artistic people and creative people out there, when there's a discussion there, open debates, and then the culture is growing. When you start silencing things, censoring the content, you have to say things. You don't have to say these things. Then it starts devolving. The culture starts devolving.
well, culture really can be a different reality.
Yeah.
And I'm unusual here. I'm saying the dictators on this planet want to impose a version of reality. And different cultures have different versions of reality.
Yes.
And just like animals live in different realities, we all
Yes.
don't live in the same reality.
Yes. Yes, Stephanie. Hey, Linda.
Yeah,
Hey,
I
Amanda.
see a few, Amanda and Linda, and the idea of consensus is not about consent. It's usually dictatorship. It's like the super wealthy are part of a consensus. They have to say vaccines are safe and effective. They have to repeat this lie over and over again. They were called the allies, the all lies.
Mm-hmm.
And what people don't quite grasp is these upper societies are there to create a consensus, not based on consent. Now, of course, if you don't give your consent, it's harder to impose the consensus. Then you are the resistance, and the resistance is targeted. But it's important to grasp this. There's two types of cultures. one that comes up from creative people, music, art, writing, poetry, dance, the
I
visual
think
arts, and
I
the
think
one that's
culture
imposed from
evolves.
the top, which tends to be science. Science tends to be the consensus or culture or technology, science or technology, that's imposed from the top down. And a lot of other cultures are being wiped out by the culture of technology. And we could have different cultures of technology. We could have packaging that easily recycles or biodegrades. We could have food without so many toxins and poisons. We could have transportation like monorail that does not do as much damage to the environment. We could have a different technological culture. And people need to begin to imagine this. The technological culture we have is being imposed. And there are other technological cultures. Now, people tend to think in terms of solar energy or wind power, but there's also houses built into the ground that are closer to 60 degrees all year round, which during the summer is comfortable because you're going to get some heat coming in. In fact, a lot of my friends whose families were from Italy used to have a living room and kitchen in their cellar because they didn't have air conditioning and also saved on heat because once you go into the ground with a cellar, you have a more consistent livable temperature. So we used to say people lived in caves, but we could also say people lived underground because they didn't have heating and air conditioning. And I like to go by comments. See if I can
Yeah,
find that comment.
yeah, I'll
I
put
think
it
it
on the
was.
screen. Uh, if
I
there's
feel
a
there's
new
stuff, and I feel high culture is in danger itself in a way. Yes and no. I follow opera a little bit and classical music. Classical music has been damaged from Bartok up with non harmonies. I don't mind Stravinsky where he ties together with rhythm, but a lot of music has been seriously damaged, even by rap. Rap is a form of poetry, and that's fine. And some of rap has incorporated musical expressions and tones and rhythms, and that's okay. But harsh rap generally is not music. It's another. I wouldn't even call it an art form. Not that it doesn't require skill. It's a different cultural expression, more related to gangster
Mhm.
culture at times. And we have to, put a lid a little bit, a limit on cultures that are too violent. It could be a militaristic culture like the Prussians, but
Yeah.
Prussia
I
was
was
really evolved into Germany.
I was going to say the same thing about the consensus. Culture is good to some extent. It could be evolving, devolving. I think the problem rises when there's a brutality within the culture and there's a consensus on it. For instance, chopping off the head, okay, it becomes a cultural thing. Uh, it could be gone. It could be some people agree on it. Some people don't agree. And when there's a consensus on it, everyone has to follow that consensus. I think that's where the when you are crossing the line.
Yeah, and you need some ultimate standards. I like to say that ethics is often applied in different situations. So you have to kind of bend the rules every once in a while. But you need these, I wouldn't say absolute, you need these ideal rules of nonviolence, of charity, which is compassion, reduction of suffering. You don't want a culture that justifies torture. Now some
Yeah.
people do, they want to go and torture our leaders and the doctors who are behaving as murderous criminals. But
And what
I
about
feel
the
no, we don't want to go down to their level. We don't want to indulge in killing. I mean, that's the French Revolution. Heads were rolling like soccer balls. So
what about
and people don't understand this. They think because they're the pigs overthrowing the farmers and animal farm, they can do horrible things. No, the revolution is really one of a new consensus, not just of the upper class, but of people who want things to be more compassionate, more reasonable. And we don't want to throw away the concept of imprisonment. I mean, we don't have to go execute all these people, but they may have to be contained among themselves because they're too harmful to others. But getting back, what is the consensus? Now,
yeah,
see, culture develops naturally. Like in Saudi Arabia or a desert, before oil was discovered, there wasn't much wealth.
yeah,
So the state or the local government, particularly with Bedouins,
yeah,
nomads, how are they going to run a prison?
yeah. Yeah,
They
they were
couldn't
simply
afford a prison,
tribes.
so the punishment was chopping off a person's hand or finger or head because they couldn't afford a prison and they couldn't tolerate criminals. So they were pushed to the Apache were like this. If a woman was caught doing adultery, they cut off her nose
Yeah,
because they couldn't
and
afford a prison. But we can afford prisons.
yeah. and uh, and there were a tribal culture, and there was a consensus on it. It doesn't matter how brutal and horrible that is, but there's a consensus on it.
Yeah, and consensuses generally are problems because a group of people generally think incorrectly. It's usually
Yeah,
only one or two that think correctly. So consensus is not a good idea. Like the
yes,
consensus reality, which was the so-called ruling class, it could be the Knights of the Round Table, could be the Massachusetts Bay Colony Council, it could be the king and his nobles. They form a consensus and impose it on the rest of the people. And we
yeah,
really need a multifaceted culture that's not based on consensus, but allows different expressions. But the people who rule want consensus, and I don't think consensus is a good idea. It arose a lot in Quakerism because the Quakers did not have a minister or they didn't have bishops. They went to a Quaker meeting, and then a consensus was supposed to arise among the members of the meeting house, and then that consensus was imposed.
yeah.
But I,
It was
I don't like consensus either. It's sort of like an abstract dictator. But
yes,
consensus becomes culture, both from the top and the bottom. It's more
mm,
based on consent from the bottom, like you have someone plays a mandolin or a guitar or a sitar. They play it well and they compose well. People like the music, they start imitating it and playing it. And
mm,
so the consensus is, oh, I like that music, and now it starts to dominate the culture a little bit. And it might be a different style or a different dance or a different rhythm. And that sort of naturally happens. And that's okay.
yeah.
It's not like someone's going to put a gun to your head and say, you have to listen to this music.
I
But
was going to I was going to say that when you say dictatorship, I think the consensus, this horrible cultural consensus, is even worse than dictatorship. In dictatorship, there is a one person ruling there. You have to throw him out. When there's a consensus on the many horrible cultural thing, then you don't know who is ruling it. You just have to
right,
follow it.
the consensus could be worse than the dictatorship because
Yeah,
your own family or your own friends could be trying to impose it on you.
yeah,
And it's kind of hard for the police to go to every house
yeah,
and
yeah,
impose a consensus. So
yeah,
if a consensus becomes culture, it's easier for family. What I always remind people, this is something, it's not totally relevant to this video or this interview, is love without respect is not love.
yeah.
The
Yes,
person who
I
claims
agree.
to love you has to respect you.
Yes,
Otherwise, they're damaging you. They don't really love you. And people
yes,
say love, 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 and they have all these feelings like people think they're going to vaccinate you to protect you from disease.
mm,
When the truth comes out, like in Israel, the vaccines make people sicker, not healthier. They're actually damaging people. So, the expression in my culture is called the road to hell is paved with good intentions, with love. A lot of people do very harmful things claiming they're being loving.
yes,
And of course, my emphasis has always been reason. You need to be educated and intelligent to make decisions about what's helpful and what is not helpful.
yeah,
Otherwise, you jump to conclusions that are not true.
yeah. I have an example about my culture, and there's a consensus on it. For instance, subjugation uh, and gender inequality is a consensus on it. It doesn't matter how horrible and wrong that is, but there's a consensus on it. And even I tried to raise my voice, but I was shut down. And the same goes in the Western culture. Is a completely We have a completely different scenario. Okay, there's a complete openness is there, but to some extent, we also see the crossing. The line is being crossed, just like you say, porn industry and many other examples of it. And there's a consensus on it. You cannot say those things, or you can say it, but in my culture, you cannot even afford to say those things openly. It's
There's
because of the
there has been, it's going away. There has been a consensus in the United States and at one time England and the English colonies that you had freedom of speech. You could discuss or debate whatever you wanted. And of course, that's being destroyed by the dictators in power. They want to dictate diction to us or how we speak. And that's, you referred to earlier that Jesse Hall's YouTube channel was removed,
yes,
which is there is a cancel culture, which is a censorship culture now throughout the world, where freedom of speech is hated, and all we're supposed to do is obey the authorities.
yes,
But
even
that's
the
becoming a consensus. A
yes,
lot of people hate those because they feel to say the vaccines do more harm than good is an attack on the medical profession. It's not an
yes,
attack on the medical profession, it's a correction.
yes,
There's a difference between attacking something and trying to correct it. But the consensus is it's an attack.
yes,
So the meaning of correcting a wrongful policy is changed from reform to an attack, and those in power even want to say the attack is like terrorism because they're terrified of a debate in which they could be shown to be incorrect.
I think it takes a lot of time to for the consensus to develop. Once it's developed in its complete form, then it is more dangerous than anything or any law, or because there so many peoples are involved, and you can't just go and tell everyone to stop and stop doing it because there's a consensus on it, and
But
you
usually
just
that
have to.
consensus, believe it or not, is manipulated by those in power. Now, people don't want to believe that because they think government and experts that these are somehow good people. They're not. The human race has allowed predators to rule it. And as a result, when what's called the middle class, meaning it's not coming up naturally from artists and poets. It's not coming down as orders. The middle class is manipulated by those to condemn certain things.
yes,
And that manipulation gets a momentum of consciousness going, the consensus, which then becomes conventions. I mean, in the United States, the meeting that elects or nominates a president, is called a convention, which is if you have a consensus that is developed over years, like the incorrect consensus that vaccines are safe because they're not. When that gets moving like a train going downhill, you can't stop it. It's a
you can
convention.
stop it. Yes,
You can only get out of the way of it
yes,
and wait till it crashes.
yes. Just like we gave the example of Afghanistan, there's so many spurs of Taliban's up there. The train is going down the hill. You just have to see and watch and how things are going because it's going to collapse sooner or later.
Right. Which is, we've seen this. There's been an attempt in the last at least 5,000 years or 3,000 years or to keep women down, that women are supposed to be basically property to some extent of men. But women of equal intelligence and character to men are going to demand their rights. There's no God given rights. We hear these expressions people were taught by the worst people, popes, presidents. The worst people teach these people, oh, human rights are God given, like Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves and abused them. Thomas Jefferson, he said these God given rights, inalienable rights. It's not true. They're alienated every day. And people repeat these big liars. They're told these big lies. Love is the answer, God given rights. And they go around repeating these lies, and reality shows them the exact opposite. They marry someone they love, and then they get a divorce, and they're facing total hell because they didn't use their reason to figure out their spouse was a narcissist or a selfish, cruel, mean, dishonest person. They didn't use their intelligence. But then they still go around saying love is the answer. They go around saying the consensus, your God given rights. There's no God given rights, they're taken away with ease.
Yeah, there's no such thing as God given rights. You just have to earn it. No one is gonna give you your rights. You
No,
just have to,
you have to defend them. It's a
yeah,
claim.
yeah,
Now you might have divine, spiritual, or support from higher consciousness. What that higher consciousness is, we don't know. There's no man with a beard you can take a picture of in the sky. Michelangelo paints this picture of a guy with a beard as God, and everyone in the West thinks a guy with a beard is God and calls God he, which is ridiculous. It's totally ridiculous.
yeah,
And if you go against, oh, stop the him,
mhm,
stop the he, because women are treated so bad. God is a he, and most of his priests are he's or males. And we're under this Western he God
yeah,
that's really a monster.
yeah,
But because it's the consensus, people bow, they pray to the he God.
yes,
And we
uh,
can't stop that because it's a train going downhill.
yes,
They've been trained to think that way on a track.
yes,
And they're going to keep repeating it despite all the evidence, like the destruction of Yemen, despite all the suffering being done. They're going to call
in the
this
name of,
he God of war loving. No, the he God of war is not loving. He has repeatedly, even in the biblical stories, if Pharaoh is a creep and his soldiers are creeps, why does the he god kill the innocent children? That's not right.
Yes, but there's a consensus on it.
There's a consensus, and truth and reason gets defeated by the consensus. Let me repeat this. It's so bad. The consensus, like the he god is good, even though he doesn't kill the monsters, the pharaohs, and the rulers of Egypt. What does he do? He kills the innocent children. Though it's evident that he god is a monster, people say God is love, God is love. And because it's a consensus, you can't stop it with truth.
Yeah,
And that's scary. The consensus, like you said, has so much power, it can destroy you within your family.
yeah,
Your family could come to a consensus you're crazy and your opinion should not be respected.
yeah,
In that consensus, you could be the most intelligent, reasonable person in your family, the hardest working in your family. The consensus is against you because you won't say their he God is love, or you won't say
you just have to follow the.
God,
Yeah, yeah,
and you won't repeat the consensus. So now you become a target of the consensus.
yeah,
So there's two cultures: the high culture, which is individuals, Don Quixote, Cervantes, Beethoven, Rembrandt, that try to get human beings to think, tries to get them to discover new feelings, new ideas, new ways of living. And then there's the consensus that's trying to impose what has been, that doesn't want
yeah,
to change except for the worse.
yeah,
And when you're up against the consensus, it doesn't matter whether you give your consent or not. They're going to crush you if you
yeah,
go directly against it. So the word culture
we have.
encompasses a lot of good and bad things, not just good stuff.
Uh, I was reading it earlier, and for instance, uh, Middle Eastern culture is different. There's a subjugation of women, and when these people migrate to Europe or America, then they follow the uh, same principles and same cultural belief in the Western culture. They
Well, they
follow
get
the East.
assimilated, particularly into money, engineering, medicine, and they have dreams of being wealthy.
Yeah.
I
But they
think a
follow the
lot of
same.
people who migrate to the United States want a big house and fancy cars and a lot of money. And
But
as a
a
result of
lot.
that, they didn't want freedom. They didn't want to defend individual choice. They didn't want to defend human rights because what their aim
They want
was financial
they
success.
they want the American capitalist the culture, the wealth and wellness, but they don't want to correct their own beliefs when they are in the follow the. It is difficult to say that they want certain things of one culture and follow the other things of the other culture.
Yeah, and there's one good aspect I like of the Middle Eastern cultures. North Africa, um, the Saudi Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, all the way to Pakistan and Afghanistan, is a recognition that a prophet, one person, a prophet, can stand against the majority. Well, good intentions and common sense aren't enough. We always have to evaluate, Amanda. Good intentions can lead to hell, like the vaccines. And common sense is not common. Common sense is actually what is conventional or what is a consensus in the culture. People who do what the culture says, like work hard, buy a big house, they're seen as having common sense. So everyone says this, that common sense is uncommon, but then everyone thinks they have it. that's that's the absurdity of it. People, I
Yeah,
mean, people say hardly anyone has common sense, but I have common sense,
yeah,
and everyone thinks that. Everyone feels that. Well, not everyone. 90%
right.
thinks that somehow they're imbued with common sense. So no, we can't rely on common sense. I think we have to rely on debate.
Yes,
Everyone else wants agreement. I want debate. I want to be challenged. I want to be able to look at my feedback. Are these ideas correct? I don't want to have good intentions. I want to have an evaluation process.
and
Now, you'll,
also we also shouldn't follow the consensus.
yeah. Um, so, yeah, thanks for hearing us. So, life isn't easy. It isn't
Yeah,
easy making choices, whether who we love, what we want, how we get it. It's complicated. And to oversimplify it is you're going to make more problems, not less problems. Now, I like to summarize stuff, but that's like
yeah,
summarizing your choices.
yeah,
Like I like to summarize, you got three basic modes. You either approve of something and encourage it because you like it, it's a good thing.
yeah,
You ignore or bypass it because you say, well, it's not that important. I don't have the time to deal with this.
yes,
Or you condemn and cite it and say, this is wrong. We have to push this away. This is not something that's going to be helpful.
yeah,
And each of those require a lot of reasoning and discernment and reevaluation because sometimes what we think is good is bad, and sometimes what we think is bad is good. So reevaluation is really important. I think it was Socrates that said the unexamined life is not worth living, which is he
yeah.
basically said evaluate yourself constantly.
Because we are constantly evolving and we have been changing. It is difficult for us to know whether we are moving in the right direction or wrong direction when we are in the process. We come to the when we get to the end, at that time we realize, oh, I was wrong. I was wrong all the way. And that's why
Well,
it is important to.
people don't like debate anymore because I'm going to just throw a number out. 90%, 95% of debate is wasting your time
Yeah,
because people are trying to impose the consensus. They're not really debating you. They're trying to impose the consensus on you. So we learn to hate debate because the people who debate us are not thinking. They're just trying, this is relevant to the topic, they're just trying to impose the consensus and think that's a debate. No, it's not a debate. Of course, I heard all vaccines are safe and effective. That's not the debate. The debate is why aren't doses per weight and size and age? Why aren't these tested by independent organizations that are not in conflict of interest or making money from it? There's real debates, and most people have a false debate. So we learn to hate debate because people say compromise and they're just repeating what is wrong in society and expect the debate to bring us closer to their wrongful position. So it's very hard to debate today because most people don't sincerely debate. They repeat the consensus, they repeat what they were told as kids. And then we have new ideas that are better. Like I feel divine inspiration. Make suggestions to you. Try this, try that, see if it works. Other people feel it's God's will be done. They're getting a message from the absolute God. And I think, no, you're crazy. God is not a dictator. The divine is inspiration for you to consider things and think on your own. You're not supposed to be a robot or a slave to any being. That's just simply wrong. And so if you debate with someone, all they're doing is repeating what they were taught. It's a worthless debate. So people have hated debates because most debates, like 90%, are worthless. They're debating with someone who is basically hypnotized by the consensus and culture. And so consensus is what those in power try to create. They get together in billionaire meetings. I'm not going to mention the names. They get together in country clubs. They get together with government officials, create a consensus and try to impose it on people through the media. And if they impose it, it becomes a convention and almost impossible to oppose. In the meantime, there is culture, which is art, literature, debate, science, rising from the bottom of culture up, which is evolving the culture to look at something it doesn't see. So there's a lot of aspects to culture and consensus, but I think Ahsan Ali made a really good point. Consensus can be worse than a dictator because the consensus can seep into your home and damage you with disrespect. Because even families have a consensus, and that could be a stereotype of you, conspiracy theorist, crazy, troublemaker, a what is it called? A heretic. You're not accepting the religion. So consensus can be harmful. So I think we have to understand the nature how consensus builds and understand the issue is not really whether we give our consent, because a big consensus can be imposed. The question more is, and which we have in Western culture, is what is a prophet, a person that can stand against the consensus and hold the moral high ground, say, well, that's wrong. That war is wrong. People being homeless is wrong. We need shelters and food and medicine for them. People can say, look, the vaccines are damaging people and it's not allowed to be reported. So standing against the consensus requires a lot of moral strength, and a lot of people do not have the moral strength, which is the precedent, the momentum for speaking in a certain way and understanding that people are going to react negatively to you because they're part of a wrongful consensus, and learning how to defend yourself from those people. Ahsan, did we lose you, or are you still here? I only see myself. I think we may have lost him for a while. So consensus is what those in power seek. They meet together. And no one is supposed to go against the consensus. This was the issue I was reading in the Massachusetts Bay Colony when the English settled the east coast of the United States. Anne Hutchinson was pushed out of the Boston area because she would not subscribe to the consensus. She really felt that theologians should not determine your relationship to God. Her position was you needed a direct relationship to God, and the council or the collective consensus said, no, you have to listen to the experts from Cambridge and Oxford and the other major universities. They've been educated. They know what God is. And she says, no, you have to have a personal relationship. And I see dangers in both. You don't want a consensus of corrupt experts. And you don't want people walking around thinking God told them what to do. You don't want either. And I think that's the problem. Many choices in culture, you're supposed to choose A or B, and you don't get C, none of the above. And a lot of times to defend ourselves, we have, no, I'm not voting Democrat or Republican, none of the above. There is no candidate that represents my position. My position isn't even presented here. So that requires courage to go against the consensus, because the consensus will give you choice within the consensus. But your choice may not be one of the choices that are given to you, because consent is not really given most of the time. Now, you may remove your consent for something, and then you are resistant to that consensus. Or if you give your consent, you're complicit with the consensus. But consent is a power. How powerful are you? In our culture, people rank power by money. How much money do you have? You can buy these lawyers. It was well known, and that's why capital punishment was for a while outlawed in the United States. A wealthy person could afford a crafty enough lawyer that they could not be convicted of murder without reasonable doubt. So it was rare for a wealthy person to be executed. All the people who were being executed in the US judicial system were poor. They could not afford a lawyer to place doubt in the mind of the juries. So, what that means is truth is influenced by a consensus of money. And most people accept that money seems to be the consensus, and people even come to the United States hoping to make more money, bigger houses, bigger cars, or fancier cars. And that has become the consensus, and now we're collapsing because the pharmaceutical industry, billion or trillion dollar industry, has grabbed control of government. And people don't want to go against it. They don't want to lose their jobs. So the money is flowing to drugs. The pharmaceutical industry is creating a mandatory market and already had a huge market where something like 50% of adults are on 2 prescription drugs or more. And that has become the consensus, and now it's becoming the culture. It's a drug culture. I think we lost Ali Ahsan. We passed the 30 minutes. We're recording this 47 minutes. So I'm going to have to sign off myself. And I think Ali made a lot of good points about the danger of consensus. And I'm saying consensus can rise from the bottom with poets and artists and critics and be good. But consensus from the top is usually bad, and they're usually manipulating the consensus of people where people can be damaged in their own families. Yeah, many people want to be right. What I always tell human beings want to say, see, I was right. Because justification is important for your health. They don't want to say, oh, they were wrong in the past, because they would be unjustifying themselves. They question and explore everything you hear and see. I'm not here to give you answers. I'm here to inspire you, like I do, to think on your own, to see different aspects rather than one definition, one cause, one reason. Like I say, with disease, there's never one cause. It isn't just a virus. There's stress involved, toxins involved, immune system reaction, hormonal states involved. There's not one cause and one answer generally. I mean, obviously there's exceptions. Someone throws a stone at you and it breaks your arm. We know what happened. And there's one solution to set your arm correctly.
Yeah.
But most things are not that simple.
So,
Okay.
how would you summarize it?
I would summarize this sort of what you said. Consensus can become terrifying, worse than a dictator, because it can invade your family and your friends. And culture is usually the result of a consensus becoming a convention, which is an acceptable practice, such as chopping off people's heads in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And it's hard to face the convention or the consensus. You have to be a prophet, have extra magical powers or divine help to do that. But culture can be good and bad. I mean, culture can be high culture, music, art, literature, or it could be political culture, which is forcing you to be obedient. And I think that's where we have to draw the line is the difference between cooperation and uh, authoritative obedience. We want to move away from the consensus that implies we don't have choice. So it's more a question of choice than consent, which is
So,
we have to imagine a choice and we have to be strong enough to reject what is wrong. And it's hard to reject the consensus. Usually it's better to get out of the way.
so do you think culture and consensus are the same thing?
The consensus will tend to evolve into culture and it can
Mm,
collapse a culture.
mm,
Countries do disappear like Prussia.
mm,
And so I think there's a process of art coming from the bottom or scientific thinking, then becoming a consensus in culture. But what comes from the top tends to be bad. What the authorities want as culture tends to be rotten. And what comes up from the people, this is why people say the people, tends to be good. You know, painters, musicians,
mm,
authors, poets, critics. And we're really up against centralization because I do think individuals become divinely inspired. And I think the group of people who rule become inspired by evil, by
mhm.
greed, by control, and try to impose a rotten consensus, which then becomes culture. So culture's result of
Eh,
two consensuses the
mhm,
dictatorship on top and the creativity of the people at the bottom. And it's good to see the two pressures.
yeah. Consensus,
Okay.
consensus is the first stage in the process, then it
Yeah.
becomes the culture.
Well,
And
actually, it's a three-step process.
uh,
It's it's
first is the
consensus,
mm,
convention, then culture.
then culture.
Yes.
And thank you so much, Ed, for joining us and for your wonderful enlightenment and learn so many things from you. And all, I like always. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Amanda, other people, Stephanie, for joining us, for your comments. And I was out for a moment because there was I was out of power, and I'm back now. And thank you. I'll check out comments later. And here's a final count birds at the top and the worms at the bottom. Question mark.
Okay, we'll see you.
Okay, here's a final comment. Answer it.
Birds at the
Uh,
top and worms at the bottom.
worm.
I think that's
Mm,
too negative.
yeah,
I don't think it's birds at the top and worms at the bottom.
mm,
And ostriches are not at the top, and butterflies are ex worms or caterpillars.
mm,
So we it's a mixture.
yeah.
It definitely human beings are not trustworthy. There's only a few good men and women.
Simple as that.
It's pretty
It couldn't be
simple.
more simple than that.
Yeah.
And thank you, Ed, and
Okay.
thank you. I'll see you next week with some other topic. And have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, midnight, wherever you are.
Okay. Bye, everybody.